Amara Wilson stepped off the train, her heart racing with hope and excitement. She had traveled miles dreaming of a fresh start and the man she had come to believe would be her future. But as Harold Pierce's eyes locked on hers, everything she had imagined crumbled. "You didn't tell me. You're black," he stammered, his voice filled with disgust. The dream she had worked so hard for shattered in an instant. Will Amara find the strength to rebuild her life? Subscribe now to watch how this heartbreaking moment sparks a powerful journey. Amara's breath caught in her throat as Harold's words hung in the air. The heat of the station seemed to press in on her, suffocating her. For a moment, everything around her seemed to blur. The soft hum of conversation from the nearby passengers, the distant whistle of another train, the rustle of the leaves in the wind. None of it mattered. All that mattered was Harold, standing there, staring at her with a look that was a mixture of horror and disbelief. Her chest tightened as a wave of humiliation rushed through her. The delicate hat she had carefully chosen for this day, the one she thought would be perfect for a new beginning, now felt ridiculous. It felt as though it were mocking her, a reminder of all the hopes she had carried with her, all the dreams of a fresh start, only to have them shattered by the man standing before her. The man who had promised her love, understanding, a life free from the prejudices she had faced in the city. Her hands, trembling, gripped the suitcase in her hand. Her mind raced, but her body remained still, rooted to the spot. The world around her seemed to fall away, and the only thing she could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat, deafening in the silence. Harold took a step back, his eyes never leaving hers, his discomfort palpable. "I thought, but you never said anything about this." His words trailed off as he looked down, unable to meet her gaze. The bouquet of flowers in his hands, once so carefully arranged, now looked pitiful, wilting in his sweaty grasp. "Couldn't you have warned me?" he stammered, the words more of a question than an apology, as if it were her fault for not somehow preparing him for this moment. His voice cracked with something that resembled panic, and Amara could feel his unease like a physical force, pushing her further away from him. Amara blinked back the sudden sting of tears that threatened to overwhelm her. She could feel them, burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was stronger than this, she had to be. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her back, lifting her chin. Warn you about what?" she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "That my skin is as dark as night? But my feelings are as real as yours? You never asked?" Harold shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. The people waiting at the station, the curious glances of the employees. He was clearly aware of the spectacle they were creating. A black woman, publicly rejected by a white man. In a town like Riverbrook, this was more than just an unfortunate encounter. It was a show. Amara's blood boiled, not with sadness, but with anger, fierce and controlled. "You knew nothing about me," she continued, her voice low but firm. "You read my letters. You imagined what I looked like, but you never cared enough to ask the truth. You were so quick to picture a future with someone who fit your idea of what was acceptable. But now that reality doesn't match your narrow view of the world, I'm suddenly not worthy of your time, your love." Harold's eyes widened, as if he were seeing her for the first time, the shock registering on his face. The truth of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. I never thought." His words faltered, his face flushing with guilt. Though it was hard to tell if it was guilt for rejecting her, or guilt for the realization that he had been so blind. Amara felt her anger simmering beneath the surface, but she knew there was no point in continuing this conversation. His mind was already made up. She wasn't what he wanted, and she wouldn't beg for him to change his mind. The thought of leaving, of walking away, was tempting, but before she could make a move, she heard a voice, deep and commanding, cut through the tension like a knife. "Is that your solution, Pierce?" The voice was filled with authority, and the words landed heavily in the air, demanding attention. Amara turned to see a tall figure, a man whose presence seemed to immediately calm the storm that had been raging. Inside her, Alexander Maxwell, the man who now stood between her and Harold, his piercing eyes fixed on Harold with a look that made the other man shrink in size. "Who are you?" Harold demanded, his voice faltering. "I am Alexander Maxwell," the man replied, his voice cool yet unwavering. "And I'm offering Miss Wilson a place to stay. She won't be going anywhere with you." Amara blinked, stunned by his intervention. She hadn't expected this. "She's fine with me," Alexander added, turning slightly toward her. "Come with me. I'll help you find a place to start over." Harold looked between them, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "You're serious?" he asked, as though unable to comprehend that someone would defy him so completely. "I've never been more serious," Alexander replied, his voice calm and unwavering. Amara's mind raced. This wasn't the help she had asked for, but it was an unexpected lifeline, one that pulled her away from the humiliation and cruelty that Harold had just subjected her to. As she looked into Alexander's steady, kind eyes, she saw not just an offer of shelter, but a promise of something more, a chance to rebuild, to reclaim her dignity, and to step into a new life. For the first time since she had set foot in Riverbrook, Amara allowed herself to hope again. This moment marks the beginning of Amara's transformation. What began as a moment of intense humiliation will soon become a turning point, a chance for her to find strength and power she never knew she had. The journey of self-discovery and justice is only just beginning, and the world will soon learn just how powerful Amara Wilson can be when she's forced to stand tall, no matter the cost. As Amara followed Alexander through the town's winding streets, her mind was a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. She had just been rejected by the man she had hoped to build a future with. And now, a stranger, this Alexander Maxwell, was offering her something she hadn't expected: refuge. She didn't know whether to be grateful or cautious. Something about the situation felt too easy, too convenient. But she followed nonetheless, her heart heavy with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. As they approached Maxwell's estate, Amara caught the curious stares of the townspeople. Riverbrook was a place that thrived on tradition, where everyone knew everyone, and where newcomers, especially someone like her, were always met with raised eyebrows. The streets were quiet, almost too quiet, as though the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. One particular pair of eyes, however, stood out. A middle-aged woman, dressed in a simple but well-tailored dress, watched them from a distance. Mrs. Foster, the housekeeper at Maxwell's estate, had seen Amara's arrival and heard the gossip that had already begun to swirl around Riverbrook. She had worked for Alexander Maxwell for nearly a decade, but she knew that even he wasn't immune to the judgment of this town. Riverbrook had always been resistant to change, especially when it came to its deeply rooted prejudices. Mrs. Foster, despite her professional demeanor, felt a twinge of unease as she watched Amara walk toward the mansion. She had seen the way the town had reacted to Amara's presence, the subtle glances, the hushed conversations. She had heard whispers from the merchants and even from the local reverend. Riverbrook wasn't ready for someone like Amara, and Mrs. Foster feared what that might mean for the Maxwell family. But as she turned to greet Amara at the door, she saw something in the young woman's eyes that made her pause. There was a quiet strength there, a resolve that Mrs. Foster had not expected. "Welcome, Miss Wilson," she said, her voice polite but cautious. "I've prepared the blue room for you. It's the one with the best view of the garden." Amara nodded, though her thoughts were still elsewhere. She had no idea what to expect from this place or from the people here. She hadn't asked for help, but Alexander had insisted, and now she found herself here, in a house that was grander than anything she had ever imagined, but at the same time so foreign to her. As Mrs. Foster led her inside, Amara's gaze lingered on the portraits that lined the walls, paintings of men and women who looked like they belonged in a different era, a different world. They didn't belong in her world, and she didn't belong in theirs. At least that's what she thought at first. Across the estate, in the dim light of his office, Harold Pierce sat staring at the piece of paper in front of him, his mind racing. He had just witnessed the most uncomfortable moment of his life, one that would haunt him for years to come. He couldn't stop thinking about Amara, the way she had stood there, so dignified in the face of his rejection. How could he have been so wrong about her? He had imagined her in his life, not as the woman he saw before him, but as something more familiar, something that fit the image of what he wanted in a partner. He had been blinded by his own ignorance. But what haunted him more than anything was the arrival of Alexander Maxwell, the man who had practically barged in, offering Amara a place to stay as if it were nothing. Harold had heard of Maxwell's reputation before, wealthy, powerful, and with a strong sense of justice. But what did Maxwell see in Amara? Was it pity or something else? Harold ran a hand through his hair, his thoughts tangled with frustration and shame. He knew what he had done was wrong, but Riverbrook, his town, his business, wasn't ready for someone like Amara. Couldn't Maxwell see that? Harold had seen the looks from the other townsfolk as they passed by, eyes filled with curiosity and judgment. If this went too far, it could destroy everything Harold had built. He had to fix this. He had to make sure that the town didn't change in ways he couldn't control. But there was something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, that gnawed at him. As much as he wanted to reject Amara, to distance himself from her, a part of him couldn't help but admire her. The quiet strength she exuded, her unwillingness to back down even in the face of his cruelty. It was a quality he hadn't expected, and it made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't explain. The next morning, the atmosphere at the Maxwell estate was tense. Amara had barely slept the night before, her thoughts racing as she lay in the blue room, staring out at the garden. It was beautiful here, peaceful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only temporary, that sooner or later she would have to face the reality of her situation. Mrs. Foster had already warned her that the town would be watching. "People here aren't used to differences," she had said. "Riverbrook is old-fashioned. They'll whisper, judge, and gossip." But what Mrs. Foster didn't know was that Amara wasn't afraid of their judgment. She had spent her entire life fighting for respect, for a place to belong. She had been rejected before, and she had learned to rise above it. Riverbrook was no different. As Amara prepared for the day ahead, she heard the faint sound of voices approaching the front door. She stood still, her heart pounding. She knew who it was, Harold Pierce. It was inevitable. He would come to try and fix what he had broken. But what could he offer her now? Words of regret? Empty apologies? It was too late for that. The door opened, and there he was, standing in the doorway, looking like a man who had lost everything. "Miss Wilson," Harold began, his voice nervous, unsure. I came to check on you. See if you're all right." Amara didn't flinch. She wasn't the same woman he had rejected yesterday. She had learned something in the quiet moments of the night. She was worthy of so much more than the crumbs he had offered her. "I'm fine, Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice cool and composed. "But I think we both know this conversation is over." Harold opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He realized that he had no power here, no control over her, and it was a feeling he couldn't stand. Amara turned away from him, her heart steady as she walked toward the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. It was time for her to move forward, to stop being a victim of others' prejudices, and to take control of her own destiny. As Harold left, defeated and ashamed, Amara made a silent vow to herself. She would no longer allow anyone to dictate her worth. She would fight not just for herself, but for every woman, every person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin. And Riverbrook, this town that had already tried to break her, would soon see just how powerful she could be. The story is just beginning. Amara's journey from rejection to empowerment would soon ripple through Riverbrook, and the world would never be the same again. Amara sat in the grand library of Maxwell's estate, her fingers tracing the spines of old leather-bound books. The mansion, which had initially seemed so intimidating, had now become a refuge, a place where she could think, breathe, and plan her next move. The house was beautiful, but it also felt like a constant reminder of how different she was from the world around her. The walls, lined with family portraits and heavy antiques, carried the weight of history, stories of a past she was now tied to yet could never truly belong to. For the first time since she arrived in Riverbrook, Amara allowed herself to think clearly. She had spent years as a teacher in Boston, educating girls of color in a school that was now gone, closed down due to lack of funding. She had never imagined herself in a place like this, a mansion that seemed too grand, too foreign, too removed from everything she knew. Yet now that she was here, she found a strange sense of purpose. The rejection from Harold Pierce had cut deep, but it had also ignited something inside her, a determination that burned hotter than any humiliation she had endured before. She picked up a book on local history, her mind racing with the possibilities. She had arrived at Riverbrook with nothing but her clothes, a trunk of memories and a dream of a fresh start. But what she hadn't anticipated was the weight of her grandfather's legacy, the legacy of Joseph Freeman. The inheritance she had received from him was not just money, but something far more powerful, documents that could change the course of Riverbrook's history. Her grandfather had been a man of honor, freed after the Civil War, only to see his land and legacy stolen by the founding families of Riverbrook, families like the Pierces. The documents she now held hidden at the bottom of her trunk were the original deeds signed by the governor in 1866, granting Joseph Freeman the land that now made up more than half of Riverbrook. She hadn't yet fully processed what this meant, but she knew one thing. The truth was buried somewhere in this town's history, and she was going to dig it up. As she flipped through the pages of the book, she found herself drawn to the section about the founding families, the Pierces, the Maxwells, and others. It wasn't long before a name caught her eye: Joseph Freeman. Her heart raced as she read the description of a man who had been forced to flee his land after a series of failed attempts to keep it from the greedy hands of the local elite. The story matched everything her grandfather had told her about his life. It all pointed to one undeniable fact: the land she now stood on, the land that had been taken from her grandfather, was the same land that the Pierce family had built its fortune on. Amara's fingers clenched the pages, her mind whirling. She had been wronged, and now she had the means to right that wrong. Meanwhile, Harold Pierce was pacing back and forth in his office, his mind consumed by what had happened at the train station. The rejection, the humiliation, the town's whispers. But what bothered him more than anything was the arrival of Alexander Maxwell. Harold had known Alexander for years, but never before had he seen the man so determined. There was something about Alexander's offer to help Amara that rubbed him the wrong way. It wasn't just the charity. It was the way Alexander had stood up to him in front of everyone. The way he had made him look weak. Harold could feel the walls closing in around him. He had built his life in Riverbrook, made connections, established his business. But he also knew that the community, his community, was built on the backs of people like him. People who had power, wealth, and the right to decide who belonged in Riverbrook and who didn't. Amara's presence threatened that, but it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about power. And power was something Harold Pierce wasn't willing to give up easily. He reached for his phone, dialing a number he had hoped to avoid. The phone rang twice before it was answered. "Pierce," came a low voice on the other end. "It's Harold," he said, his voice strained. "I need to talk to you. It's about that woman, Amara Wilson. She's staying with Maxwell, and I need to make sure she doesn't get any ideas about sticking around here. We can't let her disrupt things, not now." There was a long pause. On the other end, finally, the voice spoke again. "You sure about this, Harold? The town's already talking. If you push too hard, it could backfire." Harold's hand trembled as he gripped the phone. "I don't care what the town thinks. She doesn't belong here. I'll handle it. Just make sure she doesn't think she has any kind of claim to this town. I need to put an end to this, once and for all." Back at the Maxwell estate, Amara was deep in thought when she was interrupted by a knock on the door. Mrs. Foster entered, a solemn look on her face. "Miss Wilson," she began, her voice quiet but tinged with concern. "I've been with the Maxwells for many years and I've seen many things, but I've never seen Alexander act like this before. I don't know what's going on between you two, but, well, there's something in the air. The townsfolk are already starting to talk." Amara looked up, her brow furrowed. "What are they saying?" Mrs. Foster hesitated. "They're saying that you're a distraction, that you don't belong here, and that it's only a matter of time before Alexander's reputation is dragged through the mud because of it." Amara's stomach tightened. She had known the town would react this way, but hearing it from someone who had worked for Alexander for so long stung. "I didn't ask for any of this," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. I just wanted a fresh start." Mrs. Foster nodded, her expression softening. "I know, but you have to understand, Miss Wilson, Riverbrook isn't like Boston. People here are set in their ways, and when someone comes along that challenges that, they don't take kindly to it." Mara's eyes burned with determination. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice steady, "and I'm not going to let them decide my worth." Later that afternoon, Amara was sitting in the Maxwell Estates library when she felt strange presence behind her. She turned around to find Alexander standing in the doorway, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "You've been quiet today," he said, stepping into the room. "Is everything all right?" Amara stood up slowly, her heart racing as she faced him. "I found something," she said, her voice firm. "Something that changes everything. Something that will make them all listen." Alexander raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Amara walked over to the table where she had spread out the documents. "My grandfather's land. It was stolen by families like the Pierces. I have the proof, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." Alexander's eyes narrowed, his gaze flickering between the papers and Amara's determined expression. "You're sure about this?" Amara nodded, her eyes fierce with resolve. "I have to be." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging between them. This was it, the turning point. Amara knew that her actions would set everything in motion, that Riverbrook would never be the same again. She could feel the tension building, not just within herself, but in the very air around them. A storm was coming, and there was no turning back. As the days passed, the town of Riverbrook simmered with tension. Whispers spread faster than wildfire, and soon enough the entire town was caught up in the storm of rumors and accusations. Harold Pierce's grip on the town was starting to slip, and his desperation grew. He had no idea just how much the town's secrets were about to unravel. And Amara Wilson, against all odds, was at the center of it all, ready to rewrite the history of Riverbrook, one truth at a time. The conflict was far from over. It was only just beginning. The final reckoning, a new beginning. The courthouse doors creaked open, their age-old hinges groaning under the weight of the day's gravity. The town of Riverbrook had gathered in full force, the atmosphere charged with anticipation, tension, and a sense of impending change. Amara Wilson stood at the center of it all, her back straight, her heart pounding with purpose. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, the culmination of everything she had uncovered, everything she had fought for. The town of Riverbrook would never be the same again. The documents she had uncovered, the land deeds, the legal papers signed in 1866, were now laid bare for everyone to see. This was more than just her grandfather's land. It was the land that had been wrongfully stolen from generations of people like her, forced from their homes and denied their rightful inheritance, and now, standing before the very families who had perpetuated this injustice for over a century, she would demand what was owed, not just to her grandfather, but to every person who had suffered because of the town's silence. As Amara stepped to the front of the room, she noticed the sharp gazes of the founding families, the merchants, and even the local reverend, all of them wary of the truth she was about to reveal. Harold Pierce, his face drawn and pale, stood near the back, his fists clenched at his sides. He had tried to stop her, tried to silence her, but he was no longer in control. Not anymore. Amara took a steadying breath and opened her briefcase, pulling out the yellowed papers that had once been hidden at the bottom of her trunk. She laid them on the table before her, the ancient seal of the governor unmistakable on the documents. "I have here the original deed signed by Governor Thompson in 1866, Amara said, her voice calm but unwavering, her words carrying the weight of history. "This document grants my great-grandfather, Joseph Freeman, full ownership of the land that today comprises more than half of Riverbrook, including your homes and businesses, Mr. Pierce." Harold's face turned white as a ghost. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His worst nightmare was unfolding right before his eyes. The truth was finally being exposed, and there was no running from it. "I'm sure you've heard the story of my grandfather," Amara continued, her gaze never leaving Harold's. "The story of a man who was freed after the Civil War, only to have his land taken from him by people who thought they had the right to decide who could own what. That man was my ancestor. And now I'm here, to claim what's rightfully ours." The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. The founding families shifted uncomfortably, some avoiding her gaze, others wringing their hands in guilt. But the local reverend, an elderly man with deep voice, spoke up, his tone somber. "It's true. My father spoke of Freeman's land, but we always thought it was lost to time. We buried that history hoping no one would remember." Amara nodded. "But history doesn't disappear. It doesn't stay buried. It waits to be uncovered." She turned to face the rest of the town, her eyes sweeping across the room. "I'm not here to take revenge. I'm here to restore justice, to give back what was wrongfully taken, and to ensure that this town no longer profits from stolen land." At that moment, Alexander Maxwell, who had been standing silently beside Amara, spoke up. His voice was steady, commanding, and full of conviction. "Amara isn't here alone," he said, his gaze strong and unwavering. "She has the legal right to this land, and I stand with her. I support her claim. We can't erase the mistakes of the past, but we can choose to make things right. This is the only way forward for Riverbrook." There was a tense pause, the room waiting for the next move. Then the judge, an older man with a deeply lined face, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "I've reviewed the documents, and I've heard the arguments. The evidence is clear. The land belongs to Miss Wilson. It always has. The history of this town will have to be rewritten." A murmur ran through the crowd as the judge's words hung in the air. But then, the most unexpected thing happened. Harold Pierce, who had been fighting so hard to maintain his grip on the town, stepped forward, his face a mixture of defeat and reluctant acceptance. He looked at Amara, his eyes hollow with the realization that everything he had worked for, everything he had built, had been built on a lie. I see it now," he said quietly, his voice cracking with the weight of his own guilt. "You're right. The land, it belongs to you. And I've been wrong." The town was silent, no one daring to speak as Harold lowered his gaze to the ground. There was no more pride in his stance, no more defiance. He was broken, the weight of the past finally catching up with him. Amara took a step toward him, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. "It's not just about the land, Mr. Pierce. It's about the future we want to build together. A future where everyone, no matter the color of their skin, has a place in this town. A future where we all have the chance to start fresh." Harold nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as the room remained still, the gravity of the moment settling over them. The judge cleared his throat and then spoke the final words that would seal Riverbrook's fate. "Then it's settled. The Freeman estate will be returned to its rightful heirs, and the land will be placed under the management of the Freeman Foundation, which will oversee the restitution and the future of this town." Weeks passed, and Riverbrook slowly began to change. The Freeman Foundation was established, its purpose clear: to restore what had been taken and to ensure that the town would never forget the history it had tried so desperately to bury. Scholarships were established, New housing projects were launched and the community began to heal. The library, once Harold Pierce's store, now housed the history of Riverbrook, both the good and the bad. As for Amara, she became the heart of this transformation. No longer the woman who had been rejected and humiliated at the train station, she was now the symbol of resilience, dignity, and justice. Her work was far from over, but she had made a lasting mark on Riverbrook. At the Maxwell estate, Alexander and Amara sat on the porch, looking out over the gardens that had once been part of a private, exclusive world. The air was warm, the sunset casting a golden glow over everything. "Do you think it's enough?" Amara asked, her voice soft, almost unsure. Alexander smiled, his hand reaching for hers. "It's a start. It's only the beginning, Amara. But the most important part is that you did it. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for everyone." Amara looked out at the horizon, the weight of her journey sinking in. The past had tried to define her, but it no longer had a hold on her. She had rewritten her story, and Riverbrook's story, with courage, strength, and love. "I didn't do it alone," she said quietly. "We did it together." And with that, Amara Wilson walked into a future where she was not just a victim of the past, but the architect of a brighter, fairer tomorrow. Riverbrook, once divided by prejudice and injustice, now stood united in the knowledge that true power lies not in the land we claim, but in the community we build. The lessons learned would echo through the generations, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the light of truth and justice can prevail.